In order to be successful in 5.7, you really need to know what the traits are of the different special quadrilaterals. So this is an always, sometimes, never, and if it's sometimes, you have to explain why it's only sometimes. The diagonals of a rectangle are perpendicular bisectors of each other. Well, I start off with what I know about the diagonals of a rectangle to begin with. And the only things that I really know about the diagonals of a rectangle is that they do bisect each other and that they are congruent. There's nothing about them being perpendicular. However, the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular to each other. So if I look at a general chart, and let me put in a new thing here, I've got a parallelogram, and I'm just shortening this up. Underneath parallelogram, I've got a rectangle, and I'm not doing the shapes for these, I'm just saying I've got a rectangle and I've got a rhombus. And then special forms of both the rectangle and the rhombus are a square. So while the diagonals of a rectangle do bisect each other, they aren't perpendicular. But the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. So if the rectangle is also a square, then the diagonals are perpendicular. So this is sometimes and when it is a square. The diagonals of a rectangle are equal in length, always. The diagonals of a rhombus are congruent. Well, not necessarily. If we look at a rhombus, which is kind of like a diamond, like this, the horizontal diagonal is definitely longer than the vertical diagonal in this case. However, one of the things about a rectangle is the rectangle diagonals conjecture, and that is that the diagonals of a rectangle are equal in length. And if the rhombus is also a square, then it's also a rectangle, so the diagonals will be equal in length. So this is another sometimes, and it's also a when it is a square. The consecutive angles of a parallelogram are congruent and supplementary. Well, the consecutive angles of a parallelogram are supplementary, always, but congruent and supplementary would mean that they have to both be 90 degrees so that together you get that supplementary 180, which means it's a sometimes and when it is a rectangle. Now, it could also be a square, but I don't want to put when it's a square because then that cuts out all of those other rectangles that are also going to work. So I need to, and you could have said when it's a square or a rectangle, although that's being a little bit wordier than you need to be, because if it's a rectangle, then it'll cover that square part. And I am having a difficult time writing on this when it's a rectangle. A square is a rhombus, always. Opposite angles in a rhombus are congruent, always. So I had to actually, there were no nevers on here, and I had to explain three things. So I was looking both for, did you have the correct thing for your always, sometimes, never? And then was your explanation both correct and complete? So if you had said here, for example, when it's a square, you're leaving out a bunch of rectangles that would also work that you're not covering.